I want you to just imagine for a moment standing in London in 1888.
Oh, it's quite the scene to picture.
Right. You are in the capital of the largest empire in human history. You've got the world's first underground railway rumbling right beneath your feet, electric lights illuminating grand theaters that stay open well past midnight.
And these sweeping, beautiful avenues designed by the absolute finest architects of the era.
Exactly. I mean, it is a marvel of modern engineering, a city that genuinely believed humanity had conquered the darkness, that progress was just this unstoppable force.
But there's a catch.
Yeah, a massive one. Because if you walk less than 3 miles east of Buckingham Palace, the gaslights begin to fade. The grand avenues choke down into these claustrophobic winding alleys where two people literally have to turn sideways just to pass each other. You enter a nightmare. You enter Whitechapel.
It was essentially two entirely different worlds existing in the exact same physical space, completely separated by an invisible wall of just extreme poverty.
Welcome to this deep dive. Our mission today is to strip away over a century of myth, movies, and pop culture surrounding a name you definitely know. Jack the Ripper.
Yeah, we are tossing out the fictionalized ghost stories today.
We really are. We're going strictly off the hard facts provided in our source material. Over the next bit, we are going to explore the squalid reality of Victorian Whitechapel, the brutal truth of the victims, the unbelievable limitations of the 1888 police force, and those bizarre suspects that still fuel this massive true crime industry today.
It's a lot to cover.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want you to think of 1888 London like a massive, sprawling mansion. The front facade is glittering, it's wealthy, perfectly manicured.
Right.
But the back rooms of this house are crumbling, they're rotting, and entirely neglected.
And Whitechapel was that back room.
Right. It was the room where polite society stuffed all the horrific poverty they desperately wanted to pretend didn't exist.
It was overcrowded on a scale that is genuinely hard for our modern minds to process. Like, a London County Council report from that era actually found that in some blocks of Whitechapel, more than 800 people were living on a single acre of land.
800 people on 1 acre. Like, how is that physically possible?
By cramming human beings into literally every available inch. I mean, you had single rooms, maybe 10 by 10 feet, originally meant for one family, somehow holding 60 to 80 people throughout a building.
60 people.
Yeah, finding 6 total strangers sharing a single rented bed for the night was entirely normal. And with that level of density comes a catastrophic sanitation crisis. Whitechapel had absolutely no modern sewers.
So where did everything go?
Well, the old ones were choked and overflowing. Human waste just collected in basement cesspools. The stench was so overwhelming that middle-class visitors to the area would physically gag when the wind changed.
That is just awful. And the sources mentioned the disease rates being astronomical because of this. Tuberculosis was so common, they basically treated it like the weather. If a child coughed, the immediate assumption was consumption.
Exactly. Life expectancy was devastating.
Yeah, the life expectancy for a man in Whitechapel was barely 43, and for a woman, it was 41. So who was actually living in these conditions? Was it just Londoners who had fallen on hard times?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the people trapped in this environment were deeply divided. It created a really fractured and tense community. You had the English poor who had been there for generations.
Right.
Then you had a massive influx of Irish laborers who had fled the famine decades earlier. And on top of that, you had thousands of Jewish immigrants fleeing Russian pogroms.
And pogroms were those violent, state-sanctioned riots targeting Jewish communities in the Russian Empire, right?
Yes, massacres, essentially. These immigrants clustered around areas like Brick Lane to find safety.
So you have these highly distinct groups living shoulder to shoulder, scrambling for the absolute bottom-of-the-barrel resources. I mean, it sounds like a powder keg.
It was. They hated and feared each other. They were separated by language, by religion, and by this desperate competition for grueling factory jobs. And that actually brings us to the victims themselves.
Yeah, because pop culture really gets this wrong.
So wrong. Movies love to portray the victims of this killer as glamorous, somewhat tragic courtesans in like velvet corsets, but the reality in the sources is just devastatingly mundane.
They were just trying to survive.
Right. Women like Marianne Nichols and Annie Chapman were destitute mothers and widows. They were worn down by malnutrition, by disease, and they were selling sex in dark alleys for literally just 3 or 4 pence.
3 or 4 pence? I mean, what does that actually buy you in 1888?
That was the exact cost of a single bed in a filthy, flea-infested common lodging house for one night.
Wow. Just one night out of the cold.
Exactly, because the alternative to finding those 4 pence was sleeping on the freezing street or surrendering to the workhouses.
And the workhouses were those brutal government institutions, right?
Yeah, where destitute people did grueling, completely pointless manual labor in exchange for watery gruel and shelter. They were deliberately designed to be so punitive and horrific that people would rather die in the alleys than go to them.
So was Whitechapel effectively a hunting preserve designed to trap the vulnerable? It sounds like the killer didn't have to be some criminal genius to hide. He just had to know which dark alleys the police avoided and wait for a woman desperate enough for 4 pence to follow him into the shadows.
That is the grim reality of the situation. Because Whitechapel was a labyrinth filled with desperate, essentially invisible people, the killer's violence was able to escalate with terrifying speed. He had the perfect cover.
Let's get into that escalation, actually, because the sources repeatedly refer to the canonical 5 victims. What does canonical mean in this specific context? Like, were there really only 5 murders?
So canonical 5 is the term historians use for the baseline group of victims that almost everyone agrees were definitely killed by the same individual.
Because of the signature of the crimes.
Exactly. There were other violent murders in Whitechapel before and after this, but these 5 share a very distinct, rapidly escalating pattern.
Walk us through that timeline. How fast are we talking here?
It starts on August 31st with Mary Ann Nichols. She was found in Buck's Row. Her throat was cut so deeply the vertebrae were actually exposed, and her abdomen was sliced open. This basically establishes his baseline signature.
Okay, so that's late August.
But just 8 days later, on September 8th, Annie Chapman is found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, and the violence is drastically more extreme.
How so?
Her uterus was completely removed and taken away by the killer. Portions of her intestines were taken out and placed over her shoulder.
Oh my God. That escalated in just over a week. And he's doing this outside, in a densely packed neighborhood where people are living 60 to a house.
Yes, mostly in the backyards or dark corners of these lodging houses. The audacity of it peaks on September 30th. That's the night that goes down in history as the double event.
2 murders in one night.
Right. Elizabeth Stride is found at Dutfield Yard with her throat cut, but she isn't mutilated. The evidence suggests the killer was interrupted mid-attack by a man named Louis Diemschitz pulling into the yard with his pony cart.
So the killer just bolted, fled into the dark.
He did, but he doesn't just go home and hide. His rage clearly wasn't satisfied by that. Just 45 minutes later,
45 minutes.
and less than a mile away in Mitre Square, Catherine Eddowes is found. And because he had a few uninterrupted minutes with her, the mutilation is just horrific. Her face is destroyed and her kidney and uterus are taken.
Less than an hour.
Yeah, he was working in pitch darkness, managing this complex mutilation in about 10 minutes between police patrols.
That is terrifying. Was the final victim also killed on the street like that?
No, and that's a crucial shift in his pattern. This 5th canonical victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was murdered indoors at 13 Miller's Court on November 9th.
She was the youngest, right?
She was around 25 years old. And because the killer was indoors and finally had privacy, he spent hours completely dismembering her, to the point where she was barely recognizable as human.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Looking at the source material regarding the medical analysis of these bodies, because you have this massive debate among the doctors who examine the victims. On one side, you have Dr. Phillips and Dr. Llewellyn, the police surgeons, insisting the killer had legitimate surgical skills.
Right. They claimed the way the organs were removed meant he knew exactly where to cut, which of course fed into the whole theory that the killer was an educated doctor or some aristocrat with medical training.
But another physician, Dr. Thomas Bond, looked at the Mary Jane Kelly crime scene and strongly disagreed with that. He argued the killer had, quote, no great anatomical knowledge whatsoever.
Yeah, Bond's analysis was very different.
What was Bond seeing that the other doctors missed?
Bond pointed out that the cuts were clumsy. They were massive, forceful hacks, not precise medical dissections. He argued the killer possessed immense physical strength and a terrifying coolness about him, but he wasn't navigating the human body like a trained professional.
You know, that makes total sense. It's less like a trained surgeon executing a carefully planned medical procedure and way more like a butcher just, figuring it out through trial and error in the dark. He was learning how to cut people apart as he went along.
He was adapting, using brute force and an increasingly brazen approach.
But if he's essentially just a violent butcher, taking these massive, arrogant risks, striking twice in 45 minutes during the double event, How on earth did the police not bump into him?
It seems impossible to us now.
Right. Think about it for a second.
Yeah.
If you took away modern forensics, cameras, streetlights, and even basic two-way radios, how do you catch a ghost who only strikes in the pitch black against the most invisible members of society?
It really was an impossible task. The Metropolitan Police, specifically H Division, which covered Whitechapel, had only 486 officers.
Is 486 officers a lot for that time?
Not at all. Not for the most dangerous, densely packed square mile in all of London. And we have to remember what an 1888 police officer actually was.
They weren't detectives.
No, these weren't highly trained criminal profilers analyzing behavioral patterns. They were underpaid beat cops. Their entire toolkit consisted of a wooden truncheon, a whistle to blow for help, and a small oil lantern.
What about crime scene investigation? I know the sources mentioned they didn't have basic tools, but how did they handle a horrific scene like Mitre Square?
Forensics essentially didn't exist. Fingerprinting wouldn't be adopted by Scotland Yard for another decade. Blood typing wasn't a thing.
And DNA is a century away?
Exactly. If a Victorian beat cop found a bloody crime scene, they essentially just threw buckets of water on it to wash the blood into the gutters because they literally didn't know what else to do with it. They were just looking for eyewitnesses or someone caught literally holding a bloody knife.
To make matters even worse, the sources highlight this total jurisdictional disaster between different police forces. How did that impact the investigation?
Well, London policing was split. The Metropolitan Police handled the Greater London area, including Whitechapel, but the City of London, which is the ancient central financial district, had its own independent police force.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah. During the double event, the first victim, Elizabeth Stride, was killed in Whitechapel, which is metropolitan territory. But Catherine Eddowes, killed 45 minutes later, was found in Mitre Square, which sits just inside the City of London boundary.
So you have two completely different police forces trying to solve the exact same string of murders on the exact same night.
And they guarded their own evidence and flat out refused to cooperate with each other. This rivalry led to one of the most frustrating blunders of the entire case, the Gulston Street graffito.
Walk us through that.
So after killing Catherine Eddowes in the City of London, the killer flees back toward Whitechapel. A Metropolitan beat cop finds a bloody piece of Eddowes' apron in a stairwell, and right above it, written in chalk on the brick wall, is a message.
What did it say?
It said, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing," and that's Jews spelled Juwes.
Wow. That seems like a massive piece of evidence. I mean, it's either the killer taunting the police or actively trying to misdirect them toward the Jewish immigrant community we talked about earlier. Did they analyze the handwriting?
And they never got the chance.
Wait, really?
The Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, arrives at the scene and orders the message to be immediately washed off the wall before a police photographer can even arrive.
He erased the only piece of writing left at a crime scene. Why would he do that?
Warren claimed he was terrified the message would spark anti-Semitic riots at daybreak, given the existing tensions in the East End. But by erasing it, he destroyed a critical clue. And the City of London police were furious because the victim belonged to their jurisdiction.
I can imagine.
What's fascinating here is that the police didn't fail because they were incompetent bumblers, as history often paints them. They failed because they were human beings fighting a modern serial killer with 18th century tools. They simply didn't have the psychological framework to understand a stranger killing another stranger strictly for perverse gratification.
And into that massive vacuum of answers left by the baffled police rushed the Victorian media. The newspaper industry was just booming in the 1880s, right?
Absolutely booming. The literacy rate was rising, and cheap daily newspapers were fighting this ruthless circulation war. The publishers quickly realized that blood, mystery, and panic sold papers faster than anything else.
So they capitalized on it.
They published sensationalized, lurid details of the murders, whipping the public into an absolute frenzy. They were the ones who started the leather apron rumors, baselessly claiming a Jewish bootmaker was the killer, which, ironically, directly caused the very anti-Semitic riots Commissioner Warren was so afraid of.
But the sources suggest the media's biggest, most lasting contribution to this entire myth was the letters. I mean, hundreds of letters flooded into news agencies in Scotland Yard, supposedly written by the killer himself, and 3 of them are infamous.
Yeah. The first is the Dear Boss letter, postmarked September 27th. This is the piece of paper that actually introduces the name Jack the Ripper to the world. The writer mocks the police and promises to clip the ears off the next victim.
So theatrical.
Very. Then you have the Saucy Jackie postcard, which arrived right after the double event. It referenced the fact that he was interrupted during his first murder before the police had officially released that specific detail to the public.
And finally, this is the most terrifying one, the From Hell letter. It was sent to George Lusk, the head of a local citizens vigilance committee. And it didn't just come with a letter. It came with a small cardboard box containing half a human kidney. The sources mentioned it was preserved in spirits of wine. What exactly is that?
Spirits of wine was essentially highly concentrated ethanol. It was widely used by medical professionals at the time to preserve organic tissue. The writer of the From Hell letter claimed he took the kidney from Catherine Eddowes and that he fried and ate the other half.
Okay, hold on. The source material notes that most of these letters, perhaps even the famous Dear Boss letter that coined the name, were likely hoaxes. Are we really saying the letters were entirely fake? Isn't it highly possible the killer just wanted to taunt the police? Like, why would a journalist forge evidence in the middle of a massive murder investigation?
It's a natural question, but you have to look at the financial incentives and also the linguistic analysis. The Dear Boss letter was written in a flashy, dramatic tone that perfectly mirrored the penny dreadful novels of the era. It didn't sound like the reality of an uneducated East End butcher.
It sounded like a writer.
Exactly. Later investigations by police officials actually pinpointed specific journalists at the Central News Agency who they firmly believe fabricated the letters just to keep the story alive. I mean, think about it. If the police caught the killer, the story ends. But if a mysterious supervillain keeps writing taunting letters, you sell papers for months.
The media essentially crowdsourced the killer's mythology. I mean, without those letters, especially the Dear Boss letter, he might have just been forgotten as another brutal, unnamed Victorian murderer. Instead, they gave him a catchy nickname and turned him into a comic book villain.
It was a horrific turning point in culture. It shifted violence from a real tragedy involving real women into a perverse form of interactive public entertainment. Jack the Ripper became the world's first celebrity serial killer.
And because the media created this idea of a brilliant mastermind, society just couldn't accept that the killer was probably just a regular violent guy. So for the last 130 years, Scotland Yard and amateur sleuths have been pointing fingers at the most sensational people they could find. Who were they actually looking at?
Well, the ripperology industry still debates a rotating list of prime suspects.
Yeah.
You have Montague Druitt, a wealthy barrister who drowned himself in the Thames shortly after the last murder.
Was there evidence against him?
No, he was named years later by a police official purely based on hearsay that his own family suspected him. Then there's Aaron Kosminski, a mentally ill Polish barber. A high-ranking investigator claimed in the private margins of a book that a witness positively identified Kosminski but refused to testify.
The sources also mention a man named Michael Ostrog.
Oh, yes. Ostrog was a Russian con man who was completely smeared by police officials as a highly dangerous suspect. The problem? Later historical records definitively proved Ostrog was actually sitting inside a French prison during the entire Autumn of Terror.
You can't make this up. They named a guy who is literally locked up in another country. And what about Francis Tumblety?
He was a flamboyant American quack doctor who had this bizarre collection of preserved uteruses in glass jars. He happened to flee London right around the time of the final murder, making him a very convenient suspect.
But the theories get far more absurd than medical quacks and conmen. You have the royal conspiracy, which claims Prince Albert Victor, the grandson to Queen Victoria, committed the murders while driven mad by syphilis.
Which is wild.
Yeah, our sources confirm there is zero historical evidence backing this up. The prince wasn't even in London for most of the killings. Add to that, modern authors spending millions of dollars trying to prove the famous painter Walter Sickert was the killer, simply based on the fact that his paintings looked creepy to them.
This raises an important question, though. When you look at Druitt, Kosminski, Tumblety, the prince, the painter, what is the fundamental flaw uniting every single one of these suspects?
Not a single piece of hard evidence places any of these men at the crime scenes. No blood, no witnesses, no forensic link whatsoever. Looking at the suspect list is honestly like looking in a mirror of society's prejudices. We blame the foreigner, we blame the mentally ill, we blame the royal elite, we blame the weird artist.
That's exactly why we do it. We invent these glamorous, extraordinary, larger-than-life suspects because the alternative is deeply unsettling. The alternative is that he wasn't a mastermind at all. He was just a regular, unnoticed nobody. Admitting that an average person you pass on the street is capable of this level of evil is far more terrifying than believing in a theatrical supervillain.
So what does this all mean? When we really unpack the sources, Jack the Ripper was never caught because the police were looking for a monster, and he was just a man. He took advantage of a broken socioeconomic system, a pitch-black neighborhood, and a police force that had no scientific way to track him.
But the true legacy of 1888 shouldn't be the man who got away. The modern Ripperology movement is finally, slowly, starting to shift its focus away from the Phantom Killer and back toward the women he destroyed.
And we should speak their names. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. They weren't just props in a horror story. They were flesh and blood human beings.
Yeah.
They were mothers, daughters, and wives.
Yes.
They were failed by their society and life, forced onto those dangerous streets just to afford a filthy mattress for the night, and then they were entirely overshadowed by their killer and death.
They deserve to be remembered as the real focal point of this history, not merely as footnotes to a killer's catchy nickname.
Which brings us back to that glittering Victorian house we talked about at the start. The front is beautiful, but the back is rotting. Our obsession with true crime so often turns killers into legends and the victims into mere statistics. I want to leave you with this to mull over. If the Victorian press had never forged those letters, if Jack the Ripper had never been given that immortal, catchy nickname, would we still be talking about him today? Or would society have been forced to stop chasing a mythical ghost and finally look at the rotting, broken foundation of a society that allowed 5 women to be slaughtered for the price of a cheap bed?